If anyone's just joined us, welcome. While we're waiting to get started, we've asked that you give some thought to the best supervisor you've ever had, and in chat, share the characteristics that made that person your best supervisor.
Wow, a lot of really great, varied characteristics.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get kicked off. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see all of you again, and I hope you're joining us feeling healthy and safe. I'm really, really excited for today's session, and I want to extend a huge thank you to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, our sponsor for this program, and to TSNE MissionWorks for making today's session possible. I do want to give just a quick note that we are recording today's session, but today's recording is just for the other members of your cohort. Anyone who wasn't able to make it, it is not public, so you should still feel free to fully participate today. In this time of physical isolation and distancing, many of us are looking to our organizations and especially our teams as really important anchors for us, both socially and professionally. And now more than ever, your ability to be a supervisor that is really adaptive, inclusive, and meets your colleagues and your teammates' needs where they are, it really matters more than ever. And, you know, our mission for Boston's Future Leaders is all about building your socially conscious and civically engaged leadership toolkit. And I can't think of a topic more important than being a really incredible supervisor. And it's something that, you know, Jim Rooney actually mentioned in our last session together too. So I was so happy that he queued this up so nicely for us today. We're really lucky to have TSNE MissionWorks with us today to teach the session. They actually taught this session for a different program that I ran, Women's Leadership Program, a couple months ago, and I got so much out of it. And I've been thinking a lot about the models that they teach today. So I'm excited for you to get the same experience of having something really tangible to bring back to your organizations with you. If you've not already, please grab the attachments that I sent you in your email yesterday and have them open in front of you. We're going to be referring to them throughout the program and especially during an activity that you'll do a little later on. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to the TSNE team, Lynn, Joanne, and Owen. Thank you so much for being here. And Lynn, I'll turn things over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much for such a nice introduction, Allison. And thank you all for joining us and welcome. Today, we're talking about adaptive supervision. And I want to just start by telling you very briefly about who we are. We work for a nonprofit organization located in Boston, serving nonprofit organizations across the country. And our work is based on the belief that strengthening people and organizations that support and improve our communities is a potent catalyst for social change. We do a number of things in addition to training. We provide fiscal sponsorship to unincorporated organizations. We do this training, consulting, strategy work, and we also own and operate Boston's Nonprofit Center. I am here today with Owen Verson, who is our consulting associate. Owen uses they and them and provides incredible support to our consulting practice. I'm here with Joanne Horgan, who uses she and hers. Joanne is one of our senior human resources consultants and has been working with TSNE MissionWorks for over 25 years. My name is Lynn Freundlich. I am also a senior human resources consultant. And one of the things that we like to share about ourselves that we think is helpful for people to understand is that none of us are just consultants. We work within an organizational system, which means we go to work just like the rest of you. Of course, we're doing that from home these days. It also means that we are supervised and we are supervisors. So we experience all the daily joy that you get out of your relationships with your teammates, and we also experience the challenges. So just setting the stage for who we are and what we do. I want to cover just a couple of very brief housekeeping matters. I know that you've got some agreements around working in Zoom. I just want to review them with you here. We're encouraging you to keep your cameras on if you're able, because it replicates that in-person experience. Please add your company name in parentheses. And as I said, we also introduce ourselves using the pronouns that we use. So feel free to add those if you like. Use the raise hand function to ask and answer questions. Please stay muted until you're called upon or until we move you into some breakout rooms later in the session. And to the extent you can, please close out all distractions. We've got a couple of additional community rules of engagement that we want to share with you. One is that, well, we want the lessons to leave by all means. We'd appreciate it if you keep the stories, particularly the stories shared amongst you, private, to protect people's confidentiality and to create a community where people really feel they can share from a genuine place. Take care of yourself. These are challenging times at best, and so that means settling into a comfortable chair, grabbing your favorite drink, whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourself so that you can be fully present for the next couple of hours. And at the same time, we do want to encourage you I'm sorry, there's a distraction right there. Excuse me.
That was a great example, and I'm really glad you planted that for us to all see.
I wish it was a plant. So try to limit those distractions. And at the same time, we recognize that what's happening kind of behind people's screens and in their settings really varies widely. And so we want to be also tolerant and patient with one another if people do have distractions that they simply can't minimize. For instance, if they're engaged in learning and childcare at the same time. Here's what we'll do today. We're doing some welcoming and housekeeping. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what it means to be a supervisor and what it takes to be an effective supervisor. But most of our time together will be spent sharing and practicing a model that we call adaptive supervision. And we'll close by thinking about how to apply that and then moving on. So before we dive in, Joanne is going to take us through a short activity to help us all really focus on being here with one another today.
Lynn. So I find it helpful during this time when we are often on video calls all day long, and it's really hard to try to balance and separate what we're doing when we're working from our homes often. So if you join me, I invite you to just take a moment, get really comfortable in your seat, have your feet touching the ground if you can and your shoulders back. I invite you to close your eyes and just take a really deep breath in. And then exhale just as slowly. I invite you to just notice how you're feeling. Notice the things that may be distracting you, things that have already happened this morning, things that you have to do, and just set those all aside for the next 2 hours or so that we're together. Really try to give yourself the gift of presence. Take a deep breath in again. Exhale, shake it out, open your eyes. Notice how you're feeling now. Feel free to share that in the chat box if you would like to do that. And we will move on.
Thank you, Joanne. That's so helpful. I appreciate it. So when you were joining us, we asked you to share the characteristics of the best supervisor you've ever had. And I'm wondering, Joanne, if you can share back what some people had to say.
Yes. So we had a lot of great responses. So we have understanding. Best supervisor provided clarity. They were empowering. Human, I love that. Honesty, honest, communicative. We'll talk a lot about that. And they weren't micromanaging. A very popular answer, and Lynn will have more to say about that soon. Transparent, honest, and straightforward. Great. Influencer and strong communicator. Good. Best supervisor, she was bold, fearless, and felt like she always had our back. And she wanted to teach. Wonderful. Another, not micromanage, communicative, very empowering, a lot of commonality here. Willingness to give constructive feedback, incredibly important. Saw me for my whole self, kind of goes in the human aspect. Promoting psychological safety, great. good listener, open to upward feedback, great, supportive, effective communicator, honest, empowering, caring, advocated for me, authentic, compassionate, trusted me to do the work, and advocated for me. Great communicator and calm under pressure. Communicative, sympathetic, honest feedback, understood that oftentimes life got in the way of work.
Great.
Especially right now, right?
Yeah.
Advocated for me, great communicator and kind, proponent of my success, demonstrated trust in my abilities, used my mistakes as teaching moments, and did not feel scared to say I messed up. Really, really important. Communicative, passionate, positive attitude, understood that some things come before work, invested in my success, and trusted the person. Flexible, understanding, and advocate, also while pushing the person. And I think that's about it. And Allison, I'm glad you're calmer and more present after the grounding activity.
Thanks for reading all of those characteristics. I think by contributing them all, you've created the composite of kind of the universal best supervisor, right? And our goal is by the time we are done together, we'll all be that person, right? Yeah. When I say that in the live room, I get some head shaking and some eye rolling, and I'm sure you're doing that. But the idea here is that we want a sense of who we're striking out to be. This is a lifelong journey. And as long as we know where we're headed, and this list of characteristics has pointed us in the right direction, we know that we can continue to grow and develop and get closer and closer to being that person. But it is one of those things where there's no there. We never get there. We just keep heading in the right direction. So excellent. Good. We're going to start by talking a little bit about what it means to be a supervisor. And Joanne, I'm going to turn that over to you. Would you like me to change the slide? You ready?
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you. So before we get started and giving you kind of your first tool to get you to that ideal place that we just talked about we wanted to be, I wanted to ask folks a question, and feel free to just raise your hands in the participant box if, when you think about the time that you were first promoted to the position of supervisor or manager, whether it's in your current organization or a previous one, how many of you felt that the primary reason you were given that role was because of your kind of superior ability to manage people? Raise your hands if you feel like that was the primary reason you were given that role. Can you see, Lynn, how?
You know, either I'm not looking in the right place or no one's raising their hand.
We have zero raised hands.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting and not at all surprising. So many of the times that people are given, promoted, given that extra responsibility of supervisor, really is not have anything to do with their ability to manage people. Often it has to do with how good they are at their work, at their job, at the content, their technical expertise, their experience. So of course they'll be good at supervising. Sometimes it's seniority, how long you've been in an organization. Sometimes it's incredible growth that has happened, and all of a sudden there's all these people who need a supervisor. So here's a hat that you can wear. So what we've done, given that we realize that that's the reality, is really try and get intentional about what it means to be a supervisor. And to be able to understand that that role is really not just an add-on role. It's not just another hat to wear. It's really, when you think about it, probably even more impactful than the programmatic or content technical piece of the work that you're doing, because it has a wider breadth and you have a wider impact. So wanted to get clear. I will tell you in the materials that were sent to you ahead of time, there is a document, a job description of a supervisor that provides a little bit more detail than the slide. So feel free to look at that now or later. So the summary of this job, we know, provide thoughtful and well-planned support and direction, enabling staff members to successfully meet individual and program goals, and to contribute to the overall mission effectiveness of your organization. So I'm just going to really briefly go through these duties, and you can read more about it in the materials. But the first, Lynn, if you could animate the slide. The first thing I just want to mention is our as leaders in our organization, our responsibility around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is really not one task or job role. This is really an overlay for everything that you do. To be able to, number one, understand the differences in these three dimensions. You know, I think we can all pretty clear that diversity is really a term that recognizes the different identities that people bring and who is in the room. Whereas equity and inclusion are a little bit different and really more important in terms of making sure that everyone is included. Every person and their identity and their experience is given a voice, that they are able to contribute in a really valuable way, and that we structure decisions, communication to be able to make the most of everyone's voice. And then equity, you know, is understanding that things don't need to be the same and done the same to be fair. So what that means is that people start from different places and everyone deserves the same opportunity. So to be able to hold both of those things when you're making decisions about what's the right thing to do in a given situation is incredibly important. I think also just as leaders to be able to understand that, you know, we all bring lots of different unique identities with us to the workplace. Race and gender, however, have really been two that are deeply embedded in terms of disadvantaging certain groups in our society and in our organizations as well. So to understand that, to understand that everyone brings some unconscious bias to the table in their relationships and their communication, the way they see work done, and to understand that you have that as well. And to be aware of it, to have conversations about it, to be curious is incredibly important. To understand what you're bringing to the table in terms of your privilege, perhaps, the power that you have as a supervisor, and how that plays into the way that you work with your staff. And mostly just to really value different ways of being other than your own, and to be able to support that for your staff. So, like I said, incredibly important. Hope you'll read more about it, do some more work on it, and we'll move on. Thanks, Lynn. Hiring, I won't say too much. So the one thing I will say about hiring is we know from firsthand experience, when you are understaffed and overworked, it's really easy to go through a hiring process that is not as complete as you would like it to be, that maybe doesn't have the pool of candidates or the finalists that you really would like to be there, and you're just going to move forward and fill a position and hope it works out. And I will say, anytime that you can push back on that instinct, try to, because probably 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road, you're going to be doing it again. So really try and step back, make sure that you're really clear about what you want, make sure you have a diverse and qualified pool and candidate finalists to choose from, and make sure that your hiring process is inclusive of other people so that you're not just making those decisions from your own lens. Okay, next is orientation. So say you have hired the person, they are in, and you can take your vacation, you can do your own work now, but you should probably hold off a little bit longer, because the first few months of someone's employment, your role as a supervisor is to be really present for them, to be able to help them not only understand the organization and the work that they'll be doing and setting expectations, and that's all very important. Also finding out, you know, who's sitting either around you or virtually around you, and where the coffee maker is, perhaps. But really helping them understand the culture of the organization and the way that you want to, or that you are hoping to work with them. So sharing your style, your communication style, sharing your experiences, sharing how decisions are made in the organization and how you typically handle those and what you expect from them. And really importantly, as I mentioned, is the culture of the organization. And I will say especially as we're working, many people are working remotely right now, it's even harder to get a sense of the culture of an organization. So your role as a supervisor is to help people understand what that is. I just want to tell a very short, funny story, I think, about Lynn. Years ago, Lynn changed jobs, and her second day at the new job, she was in a meeting, and her new supervisor said, Lynn, we start all of our weekly meetings with check-ins. Welcome, why don't you go first? And Lynn was very comfortable. She just came from an organization that checked in every time they sat down together, whether it was one-on-one, team, all staff, check-ins were a part of it. So Lynn thanked everyone, shared how she was feeling that morning, and a funny story on something that happened to her on the way out of her house. And everybody politely nodded and smiled, and then went around the table and checked off on their work-related item for the day. So Lynn, as the new person, felt really silly. And her supervisor had no intention of making her feel silly. But what check-in in one organization means is so different than what check-in in another organization means. And that's something that if you've been in an organization for a while, you may not even realize, just assumptions. So I tell people, ask people who started in your organization in the last year, what do you wish you had known in the first month or two that you started that you didn't know? And then take that information and build it into your orientation process. So, okay, thanks. Let's move on. Training and development. You know, I think the important thing here for supervisors is to understand that this goes beyond training they need to do their jobs. This is really an investment in them as people. And we heard a lot of that in the chat around best supervisors, to know that you're invested in them as people, not just as your employees or the organization's employees. And keep that conversation going about learning. What do you want to learn that's not necessarily part of your job description? How can I help you? Is there a connection I can make for you? So you want to keep that going and not just have that conversation once a year during the annual review time. I see some laughing. Is there anything going on in the chat, Lynn, that we should know about? You're muted, Lynn.
There are some comments about how embarrassed I was.
Oh, that's great.
Which is true.
Oh, okay, so after training, let's move on. I think the next one is meeting regularly. This, we feel, is the most important structure that needs to be put in place for everything else we're talking about to really be successful. This is where the magic happens, we say. And our strong recommendation is that supervisors are meeting with their staff at least every other week for at least 30 minutes at a time. That's going to vary, obviously, depending on role and if someone's new or not. It's going to be much more frequently if it's a new employee or a new relationship. But this is where you're going to be able to really get to know each other, get to give each other feedback, and put a lot of this in place. So what's the next? Communication. So at the end, so a few years ago we did this, and at the end someone raised their hand and said, now I know intellectually all of these things are important, but I do not have the time to focus on all these. So if I was going to pick one, which one should I pick? Now I would never tell any of you to just pick one, but if you're going to really spend energy and focus, communication is a great place to do it because it is the foundation of everything else. So let's move on. Performance management, goal setting and evaluation. This is another incredibly important role for a supervisor. And it's not something that really should only be done at annual or formal review times. Performance management is the entire process of working with someone around their job and their development. So it's giving feedback, positive feedback, giving constructive feedback, helping them set goals, asking them questions that help them lift up things that they can do better, and giving them evaluative data throughout the year, not just on a form of the year. So thank you, reward and recognition. This one, really incredibly important for supervisors and often one when we're very busy that we forget to do. Someone told me at the end of every day once, ask yourself 2 questions. Who's one person that I need to thank today or that I should thank today? And what's one thing that I learned today? And I loved those questions. For a long time, I did them. I put them on a sticky on my desk, and I would ask myself those every day. And especially the who should I thank today? It's amazing I would say 80% of the time, if I hadn't gotten in the practice of asking myself that question, I would not have actually followed through and thanked that person. Making sure it's a meaningful thank you. It's something that's valued by the person. Know your staff well enough. You know, if you want to send out a all staff email saying that someone did something wonderful, and you know, that's great for some people, and for some people they could be really horrified by that and not want that kind of attention. So know what your staff appreciate, and make sure it's valuable and specific. You know, more than just a thanks, great job. You know, what did they do? Why was it so important? And last but not least, implementation of personnel policies. I won't say much about this, but to say as supervisors, I think it's fair to say that you don't need to know every policy and the ins and outs, but to know when to lift things up to your HR or to your director or whoever is responsible for that. Things that you see, discrimination, harassment, bullying, things around pay and overtime, questions around that, any kind of medical situation that comes up with staff, just make sure you're raising that up so the organization can deal with it. So that's it. I know that you know, this is all probably not surprising and can feel overwhelming all at the same time. So I'd love it if we could ask you some questions as you think about the job areas that I just went over. And I'm curious if you could answer these in chat. Any or all of the questions are fine to think about and answer, but which of those areas do you enjoy the most? And which do you spend the most time on? And are those the same or not? And which do you find most challenging? So Lynn, I will ask you to lift up any responses to those questions.
I will. They're just starting to come in.
Okay, great.
As Allison's pointed out, for people who aren't currently in a formal or official supervisory role, they can talk about how they approach other relationships through this lens. Meeting regularly takes up a lot of time. Absolutely.
It absolutely does. You're right. And that's a real investment. You know, I will say that yes, it takes time. And when we work with supervisors who come to us, and employees actually, with problems that they're dealing with and conflicts with their supervisor, and we ask them if they're meeting regularly, I would say 90% of the time the answer is no. Yeah. So yes, it takes time up front, and it can absolutely save time by building that relationship and understanding down the road. And also you can kind of get into some discipline and practice about saving things for your meeting that maybe you normally just check in with each other multiple times a day. And I'm not saying you wouldn't talk to your staff during the day, but to be able to say, you know, we're meeting Thursday. Can this wait until then, or should we talk about it now? And many times things can wait. Anything else?
I'm seeing a number of people are talking about really enjoying coaching and career development, professional development, that sort of thing.
That's fantastic, actually. And because actually that's something that's often kind of falls by the wayside in really busy settings. So for anyone who loves coaching and professional development of their staff and helping them grow, you are going to have such an invested staff person because they're going to feel like you care about them as a person. They're not just kind of a widget coming in to do their work and going home at the end of the day. So any practices that you have, I know you're going to be meeting again in a cohort around that you want to share with each other, I think would probably be really helpful.
I'm also seeing that for some people, reward and recognition is the most rewarding, or the piece that they like the most, and for other people, they find it to be most challenging.
That's really interesting. Well, you know, it is rewarding when it's sincere, I think, and when you see that the person becomes more energized and motivated by the positive reinforcement and appreciative feedback that they're receiving. It can be challenging when you feel like you have you have an obligation to give them something that you're not sure you can give. So rewarding employees with promotions, with bonuses, with special perks, may be out of your control in your organization, and to realize that there are to get to know what your employees value, and maybe it's flexibility in their schedule, maybe it's extra opportunity to train with someone outside of the department or outside of the organization. So to be able to get kind of creative and provide them with things that are meaningful for them can be rewarding.
Yeah, there are a number of other things here. One of the things that I'm really appreciating watching this chat is the support people are providing to one another. It's really interesting and enjoyable to be working with a group of people who are cohort and learning together. So great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So I think at this point we are going to move into thinking about a model of how to be adaptive in the way that we supervise your staff.
We are. Thanks, Joanne. So this is a two-part model in thinking about how to be adaptive as a supervisor. And the first part of the model is an opportunity for us to think about ourselves and our inclinations and preferences around supervising. The idea is that each of us has a natural preferred style. It's not the style that we use because we think we should, or because some role model supervised us in this way, but it's really what we're naturally inclined towards. And there are 4 supervisory styles in this model, and the first is a directing style. I want to say before I walk us through the styles that there's no best style, there's no right answer. This part is really about developing some self-awareness about the ways we typically approach supervision. So for people who like to be directive, they generally break tasks down into very small pieces, provide step-by-step instructions. They often actually do work side by side or show or demonstrate someone how to do something rather than just giving instructions or expecting them to know how to do it. Directive supervisors are really clear about expectations related to each goal or objective. As they break the work down into small pieces, they're very specific about what they expect within each of those pieces. And they monitor progress and compliance with rules and regulations. Basically, for directive supervisors, there is a right way of doing things, and they see themselves as supporting people in developing the ability to do things that way, the right way. So that's the first style. The second style we call coaching, and coaches provide extensive and regular feedback both on the how someone is doing the work and also on the end product or the result. Praise for good work is particularly important to coaches, and the characteristic that I think most clearly differentiates coaching from other styles is that coaches are cheerleaders. It's really important for coaches to convey how much confidence they have in people to be successful and to grow and develop. And so one story I like to share about this is that many years ago, my partner was a soccer coach. And this is a time when our kids were really small. And if you've ever seen little kids play soccer, you've probably seen them in a pack running up and down a field. A couple of players are at the front of the pack and they have access to the ball, and everyone else is at the back of the pack. Well, there was one little girl on the team named Rose. And Rose was that kid who was always at the back of the pack. And whenever it was time for Rosie to come out so another player could go in, she would get really frustrated. She would crinkle up her face and stomp her foot and say, "I didn't score." And each time Billy, my partner, would say, "Rosie, this is it. Next time you go in, you're going to score." And he'd put her back in when it was her turn, and she'd run around and be at the back of the pack. Eventually, as the kids got older, Rosie went off and played girls soccer. I had 2 sons, so we went off with the boys soccer. And so my partner was no longer Rose's coach. But as she got older, she became a really successful soccer player. And in high school, she had to write an essay about an adult who made a difference in her life. And she wrote about Coach Billy, which was very sweet. But what she said is the thing that I think is really important. She said that because he believed in her, she didn't give up. She didn't quit. And that's why she continued playing soccer and eventually kind of found her way. So I think that's a great example of what coaching can look like. It was a very long time ago. Rose has graduated from high school. She's graduated from college. I hear she plays ultimate frisbee now, not soccer, but so be it. The third supervisory style is a facilitative style. And supervisors who like to facilitate really serve as a sounding board as staff make decisions about how to do their work. So they're basically providing assistance as needed, but encouraging staff to try to chart their own course, their own path for accomplishing something. And they create space to discuss concerns and problems, but don't necessarily have to have the answers themselves. So that's a facilitative approach. And supervisors who like to delegate assign really broad goals. They don't concern themselves with how staff get there. They expect them to create their own work plans. They typically allow staff to correct their own course and solve their own problems along the way. They provide feedback on the end results, but not how we got there. And they encourage risk-taking and entrepreneurship. So let that sink in for a minute. And think again about your preferred style, the one that comes most naturally to you. Again, not the one that you operate from because you think it's what you need to do, it's required of you, it's the culture of your organization for whatever reason, but what do you like the best? And Allison is going to put up a poll for us to give you an opportunity to share and tell us which is your preferred style. And I want to remind you again, there's not a right answer. This is about self-awareness. Love seeing this information come in. Thank you for responding. We'll share the results when everyone's had a chance to respond. But what I'll tell you is that coaching is in the lead with facilitative close behind. We definitely have some directors and some delegators.
I'm going to keep the poll open for just another 5 seconds. So if you have not yet submitted an answer and you would like to, please do it now. In 5 seconds, I'm going to launch the results.
Great. All right. Are you sharing the results, Allison?
Yes, they should be on everyone's screen now. We have 44% coaching, 30% facilitative, 16% directive, and 11% delegatory.
Almost a natural bell curve. Yeah, that's not surprising. And I'm noticing in some comments, people talking about when they choose one style over another, and that's actually what we'll be talking about next. So I'm going to keep this in the back of your mind. This is half of the model, who you are as a supervisor, who you are naturally. We can stop sharing the poll, and I want to talk about the second part of the model, which is how we think about the people we supervise. And so the idea here is that we can think about how they do their work along 3 dimensions: ability, experience, and motivation. And for these purposes, when we talk about ability, what we mean is an innate inclination for the work that they're doing, which then I think increases the speed with which people can learn. Experience is their familiarity with the work. Have they done this work before or something very similar so they have transferable skills? And motivation is a combination of confidence and energy level. So let me give you an example. In a job I held a long time ago, I facilitated volunteer orientations. I was in that job for 9 years, and I did volunteer orientations 3 times a month. So you can do the math. It was a lot of volunteer orientations. And not knowing this model, if my supervisor had said, hey, how are volunteer orientations going? I would have said, great. I can do them in my sleep. People circle 5s on the evaluation forms. I think they're effective. We don't need to talk about this. However, if we'd known this model and we'd broken it down a little bit more deeply, what we both would have learned is that my ability and my experience were very high, but my motivation was kind of in the basement. I was extremely bored. I had done these things over and over and over again. And when one appeared on my calendar and I said, oh, I have to do another orientation, it would just sap all my energy. And that would have been really helpful to know. So we can think about how our staff approach different parts of their jobs on these dimensions, and we can actually rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is low and 5 is high. And then we can come up with a numerical indicator by averaging those numbers. So for me, with volunteer orientations, my ability and experience were at a 5, but my motivation was very low. It was at a 1. So doing the math, adding that up, coming up with a numerical indicator, I would have been at about a 3 or 4. And that's helpful because not only would it have given some additional information to my supervisor and to me, but when we use that numerical indicator, we can match it up with supervisory styles. So when someone is at a 1, and they have low ability, low experience, low motivation, then the directing style is going to be the most effective way to work with them around that part of their job. When they're at a 2, coaching is going to be most effective. When they're at a 3, some combination of coaching and facilitating works. When they're at a 4, a facilitative approach will work best. And when they're at a 5, you can delegate. So when it comes to volunteer orientations, if my supervisor and I had applied this model, she may have been able to more intentionally provide support around this part of my job by providing some combination of coaching and facilitating. And it might have looked like coaching around reminding me, you're good at this, that cheerleading thing. People appreciate what you're doing, it's effective, and that can give you energy when you get that sort of positive rah-rah feedback. The facilitative part around asking open-ended questions. Okay, so you're bored. What are you going to do about it? When was the last time you changed up the curriculum? And asking me questions to help me figure out how to solve basically my motivation problem. And so that's how the model works. I'm curious what you think. If you've got questions or comments or reflections, why don't you go ahead and write them in chat, and we'll lift them up a little bit to talk about. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Yeah, it's funny. It does seem so obvious and like, oh, of course, that makes sense. But without having the model itself and the reminder that we actually have to adapt to meet our staff needs, it's easy to just fall into our most comfortable style. One of the things that I often say is that sort of old-fashioned model of leadership or management, like, oh, this is just how I am and my staff have to just deal with me, that's not really effective. And this is a reminder that we can, instead of taking that stance, our responsibility as supervisors to adapt to meet their needs.
So Lynn, we have a couple of questions.
Great.
A lot of people are finding the model helpful. So there's a question here from Michelle. If motivation is a 1 for someone, how would directing be a good approach to take?
Yeah.
Or am I reading applying the graph wrong?
No, you're not applying the graph wrong necessarily, but it's not just about motivation. It's about the combination of motivation, ability, and experience. Let me just switch the slide here for you. So if motivation, experience, and ability are low, then being directive is helpful. But if it's motivation alone and their other dimensions are higher, you want to kind of adapt your style to meet the kind of overall approach. What I do think, though, about low motivation is that sometimes it can just be helpful. I think coaching is really helpful around motivation. But if that's not the right style, given their how you would rate them on other dimensions, I think being direct can help people too in basically saying, I really need you to do this. Kind of lifting it up. People tend to deprioritize the things that they're not motivated to do. And so a directive approach can really orient people and say, you may not enjoy this, but you need to do it. I think if you're really focusing specifically on low motivation, one of the ways to increase motivation in that directive context is to provide context and explain why it's important. And sometimes that connection between the work someone's doing and the outcome or the mission of the organization, that sort of thing can help with motivation.
And I think that really is very related to another question, which is if people really feel like they're strong in coaching, enjoy coaching, and they're strong in it, how do you get someone who's really low across the board to get to a place where they can really benefit from coaching? And it sounds a little bit like what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, I mean, that actually raises a number of questions. So if you really enjoy coaching, is it your goal? Is it everybody's goal to get all of your staff to a place where you can then coach? I would argue no. I would argue that it's really your role to be aware, hey, I like coaching, and it's going to work well in situations where that's what's called for, but in other situations, I'm going to have to adapt. And if I really like coaching, what I may need to do instead is be directive. Or if I really like coaching and it's not going to be effective, maybe what I need to do is delegate. So.
Yeah. And there's a lot of validation here. People who say that they've had to supervise in a style that's not really natural for them. Say a directive style with more interns or newer, less experienced folks, and what a learning curve and a stretch it can be.
Yeah.
But understanding the need to do it, obviously. How do you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's a really interesting point, because we often find, and we saw it here too, that directing is rarely the most popular style. And I think it's because what we saw in the chat when we were asking you to describe the characteristics of your best supervisor, people don't want to micromanage. And we don't like to be micromanaged. And so we can conflate the concept of micromanaging with directing. I would actually argue that micromanaging is misplaced directive approach. It's using directive approach when it's not the best style. But it can be difficult for people. And I think it's because we want to convey trust and respect to the people we work with. And it can feel that being directive isn't trusting or respective. And I'll make the case now, and I'll probably make it again later, that sometimes being directive is actually the most respectful thing we can do for someone who needs it, because it sets them up to be successful.
It's very, thanks, Lynn. It's related also, someone else, Mike, said, you know, they feel that coaching and facilitating carry a more positive connotation than directing and delegating, which is really interesting. I feel like some of that may have to do with kind of our own values, you know, our own personal values in terms of what styles we feel are more, you know, have positive or negative connotations.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I want to pose another question, and I'm going to ask if you have an answer that you raised your hand, and Joanne's going to help me call on people whose hands are raised. So if the foundation of this model means that we need to be able to assess where our staff are at around various aspects of their job, if we need to assess their ability, experience, and motivation, how do you suppose we can do that? I promise you it's not a trick question. And I'd love to have someone raise their hand, and so we can unmute you and hear your voice, bring your voice.
Okay, we do have a hand raised. The first one I saw was Alyssa.
Great, thank you. Can we unmute Alyssa? Hi, Alyssa.
Good morning. Thank you so much. This is amazing. You're blowing my mind this morning, so thank you.
Welcome, that's nice to hear.
I think one of the biggest things obviously would just be really working on communication and making sure that you're getting that back and forth dialogue to engage everyone and try to share through that.
So it sounds like you're suggesting that in order to assess someone's ability, experience, and motivation, you would ask them about it. You would talk with them about it and have a conversation?
I think so. I mean, I think Blair had a good question a bit earlier too. I think the trick is when someone has a very different feeling about their ability perhaps, or their motivation than what they actually do. And Blair asked it more eloquently, but I think in general, yeah, I mean, I think you want to make sure that you understand from your employee's perspective where they think they're at. And I think that can be a really great jumping off point.
Yes, absolutely. And between Alyssa and Blair, you have nailed the answer, because it's really a combination of things. We do want to have conversations with folks. We do want to get their perspective. And I think the risk in only doing that is exactly what Blair raised, is that sometimes people don't have the self-awareness to accurately assess their ability, experience, and motivation. I'm sure many of you, I know I have supervised people who are overconfident on their ability or their experience. People may not feel like they have enough trust in their relationship with supervisors to be completely transparent if they're not feeling motivated about a part of a job. And so having that conversation is an important piece of this, but it can't be the only piece, because we have to assess the information that people give us. So the other way of doing this is through observation. And what do you think? How have you observed people doing this particular part of their job, and how would you assess their ability, experience, and motivation? I think the risk in only doing that ties back to what Joanne was talking about earlier when we were describing the job description for supervisors, that we all bring kind of unintended and implicit bias, and so we don't necessarily see things objectively. And so getting data from people we work with and combining that with the data based on our observations is probably the best way to assess somebody's ability, experience, and motivation.
Hey, Lynn, there is a question in the chat, which I think might be worth lifting up, is how do you deal with situations where the person is unlikely to voice their motivations?
Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about when we work with supervisors is really investing in building mutually respectful and trusting relationships. And that's easier with some than others. And some of that has to do with who we are. Some of it has to do with identity. So being very intentional about creating those relationships, I think, can set you up to be successful in applying this model and in many other ways. We won't really go into great detail here, but one of the ways you can do that, is by ensuring that you are scheduling regular one-on-one supervision meetings, because that's a place where relationships get built. They don't replace team meetings. It's important to have team meetings and all staff meetings and all of that, but really investing in building that relationship through one-on-one conversation can help. I think it's also fine to share this model. If you're having this conversation with someone and they don't understand why, it might feel like a trap or it might feel disingenuous. But to be able to say, hey, I went to this training and look at this model, and here's what I'm thinking is my preferred style. Maybe ask for some feedback on that. And how does that work for you? Taking feedback that someone who reports to you gives you and receiving it as a gift and receiving it in a way that is very grateful and not defensive can help create trust, so that we can then say, so how do you think you'll go about this part of your job, conducting volunteer orientations, fundraising, whatever it is. I think can create the container to start to build more trust, and then get a more accurate read from people on their ability, experience, and motivation.
Lynn, I just wanted to lift up one other thing. Michaela had said, she's applying this to her last job, and she can see now how she needed those different type of supervision as she grew and changed in that role. And I think, in aligned with what you're saying now, when you're sharing the model, to be able to share your own past experiences as well, it'd be really useful for staff.
Right. So to be able to reflect on, when I was being supervised and it wasn't a good match, here's the impact it had on me. I want to be sure as your supervisor that I'm meeting you where you're at. I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think that as people who are supervised, we can ask for what we need, and we can encourage our staff to ask for what they need. So if I'm delegating and you're feeling lost, I hope you'll let me know. I'm delegating because I've assessed your ability, experience, and motivation is really high. But if you need something different from me, please ask. And that's another way of building trust, and another way of kind of fine-tuning your assessment of someone's ability, experience, and motivation.
We do have a couple of other hands raised, Lynn. I don't know if it's Sunita and Anusha.
Let's call in these two people, and then let's move on to our activity.
Okay, so let's start with Sunita.
Hi, Lynn. You already covered it. In my past role as a supervisor, I used to assess the ability, experience, and motivation based on the results. So if the results were like a bare minimum, I knew that, motivation might be something that I need to, help them build. If there were, actual errors, or, the work was not complete, then that would probably say something about the ability. And I would assess experience if things were done exactly the same way as they had been done in the past. So the experience would be a high in that case. So that's how I used to assess, and kind of mentally rate their ability, experience, and motivation based on the results I see in their work.
Absolutely. And I think that is a good part of assessment, looking at the end results and then kind of backing out to how did they get there. I think also, to the extent that we can, evaluating the process, actually looking at how they got to those results is helpful. And I will just reiterate that assessment coupled with conversation is probably going to net you the best information. But that sort of assessment is a really important piece of it. So thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
And then we also have Anusha.
I'll go super quick because I know this is just repeating, but one of my favorite things to do when we get new team members is when we start working on, one, getting to know who they are, their past projects. A lot of times people have like certain things that they were really proud of, like what they worked on. And it's just identifying some of the skills that come from that, or, maybe it's like, oh, I really enjoyed coordinating X, Y, and Z, and is trying to replicate that and putting them in a situation where they're not gonna fail. And then asking them to what were some of the things that you didn't get to work on that you wish you could. So trying to identify areas that they can, move from like a 3 to a 5.
Yeah, I love that. I love that kind of collaborative, like, let's figure this out together approach through conversation and observation and reflection on experience. That's great. Thank you for adding that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a chance to try this model out. Let me switch the slide and I'll explain what's going to happen next. So in a few minutes, we are going to move you into breakout rooms based on your preferred style. So don't do it yet, but when I'm done spelling out the instructions, what we'll have you do is everyone needs to choose a preferred style. It's the preferred style for this activity. You're not going to leave this session with a tattoo on your forehead. So if you change your mind by the end of the session, that's okay. And again, this is not the style that you use the most or that you think you should be doing. It's the one you're most inclined to. It's the one you're most comfortable with. So we'll have you make that choice. And then while we're organizing breakout rooms, we're going to give you a chance to take a 5-minute stretch break. When you come back, you will be in the breakout room with, I think, 3 or 4 other people. Is that right, Allison? The size of the breakout rooms?
Yes.
Great. And once you're there, you should find the packet that Allison sent you and find the case study that corresponds with your preferred style. You'll read that, and then together with the folks in your breakout room, you'll answer the questions that are embedded in the case study and also on the worksheet that was in the packet we sent. You'll have 15 minutes together. We'll give you a 2-minute warning so you know when we're about to pull you back. One important thing to do is for each breakout room to choose someone to report out. We're not going to have every group report out. You're too big, but I am going to need to call on people who are reporters. So please, please do that. I promise we're not going to put you on the spot for long. I'm only going to ask you a couple of questions. If you need help when you're in your breakout room, you all may know this, but I learned the hard way. If you ask for help through chat, we will not see it, but there is a help button, and this slide will show you where it is. If you need help, reminder of the instructions. If you're having some technical problems, please press that button, and someone will come and try and help you. Allison, is there anything you want to add to my instructions?
I think those are great. So I'm not seeing many people using the reaction buttons yet. So
yeah, I had said not to yet. So now you can begin doing that. And once everyone's done that, I'll let you know what time to come back from the break. So Allison, you let me know when you feel like you've gotten the information you need. Okay.
Perfect. So for those who haven't done this before, click on participants. And then in the same area where you see raise hand, you should also see these reaction buttons. It says yes, no, go slower, go faster. And you're going to match it with the key that Lynn has provided on the slide to tell me which breakout room to put you in. Everyone should be back now. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back. So this is an opportunity to apply this model to a case study. They're case studies. I know they were a little bit exaggerated. That was by design. And so I'm hoping that you all remembered to assign a reporter. And what I'd like to ask is that reporters from the directive groups, please raise your hand and I will call on one of you. And I promise I'm not going to ask you difficult, challenging questions. Just want to hear, great, we've got Melissa. Melissa, could you take yourself off of mute, please? And if you would share with the group one example, and I know you have many, one example of something that the supervisor in your case study did that was really, really directive.
It was aggressively specific instructions that didn't allow for Mary to use her creativity, her experience, or just her abilities to make smart decisions about how to approach the project.
Give us an example. What's something that the supervisor told Mary to do?
Make sure you use Google because it is the best browser, and also the exact breakfast order instead of just saying, hey, order breakfast. Maybe think about vegetarians too, just in case. It was very specific.
Very, very specific. Exactly. Thank you. And I should have said actually to all of you, you had similar case studies in that each was about Mary or Mark, who had been running a program and was asked to start a new program. But from there, the case studies diverged because each version of Mary or Mark is different and each supervisor is different. So this supervisor, Melissa, was really directive. They said, what, to order for breakfast. They said use Google. They said which font to use. How did that work out?
It didn't work out in a shocking twist. Mary was lost all motivation from what sounds like a really great opportunity for someone to lead a project, and she lost all motivation because it seems the way that the supervisor was directing that it would be unattainable to find success because it would just be a constant micromanaging to the ultimate point.
That's great. And you use the word micromanaging there, and I think I referred to this earlier, that I tend to think of micromanaging as misguided directive approach, using a directive approach when it's not called for.
Right.
So good. What did you decide would have been a better approach? How did you rate Mary's ability, experience, and motivation and match that up with a supervisory style?
We ended up giving her an average of 3.2, I believe, and thought that the facilitating style would be better for her and for the supervisor. If the supervisor is inclined to be more directive, facilitating will allow them to get a better feel for the project and how it's going, but also gives Mary the leeway to use her previous experience to apply that to find success in this.
Excellent, thank you. So you're tapping on her previous experience, which was really rather high. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, I appreciate it. Could we have hands for reporters from the coaching style? I've got Hannah. Great. Hannah, could you join us and remove yourself from mute, please?
Morning.
Hi, I'm going to ask you the same question. Can you give us an example of something really coach-like that your supervisor did?
Yeah. So one thing was that we had Mary as well, and the supervisor did a good job providing feedback on how positive they thought that Mary was, what a great job the work that she's done in the past. And so the supervisor is very confident in Mary's ability. They praise Mary often, and I think, again, build the confidence in what Mary needs.
That sounds great. So someone who's saying, you're awesome at this, you're going to do great. Mm-hmm. That must have worked out well, right?
So not so much for the supervisor. For Mary, she took the project and ran with it, but that wasn't exactly what the supervisor felt most comfortable about. It made our group think back to some questions at the beginning of the program about how the supervisor really needed to change what was best for Mary and not just for themselves. So we talked a lot about that.
Great. And what did you decide would have been a better approach for this version of Mary? Each version of Mary or Mark is different.
Yeah, we talked about how delegating would have been best. Across the board, we agreed her ability was a 5, her experience was a 5, and her motivation was a 5. But because the supervisor doesn't know Mary on a personal trusting level, that they need to figure out a way to have both sides work, and delegating seems.
You have landed on something that I think is really important about this case. And what I'll tell those of you who didn't read the coaching case study is that this version of Mary, boy, she went off and ran with it and was probably successful. The supervisor was hearing through the grapevine about all these great things that Mary was doing. But what Mary wasn't doing was showing up at supervision meetings. Mary was blowing them off. And so I think you're right, kind of thinking about what the supervisor needs to do. Certainly being adaptive and delegating the project work makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. This case study is a really good example of how if you break down someone's approach to a particular part of the job, the smaller you break it down, the better. So in terms of launching this program, delegating made sense. It's possible that in terms of keeping the supervisor in the loop, if you look at that as a particular job function, maybe the supervisor needed to actually be very directive with Mary there. So sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum. You can go off and run with this. I know you're going to do great things. And I need you to keep me in the loop about this, this, and this. And so we're going to have meetings every other week. And it could be really directive at the same time as delegating. So a little bit of a twist there for you. And it sounds like you largely got it. Thank you. How about our facilitators? Could we get hands for facilitate? Oh, all right. We got Michaela. Is that right? Can you unmic yourself? And I'm going to ask the same question. Give us an example of something really facilitative that your supervisor did.
So in our case study, they went into it asking a lot of questions. So trying to get Mark to sort of come up with the answers on their own. And that didn't go over as well.
What happened to poor Mark?
So I think he was just flustered. Like he didn't feel confident enough to have all those answers on his own.
Yeah, that's right. So for those of you who didn't read the case study, Mark actually broke down in tears. He was so frustrated that he cried. And what was it that you think upset him so much?
He felt like he needed to come up with the right answer rather than that there wasn't a right answer.
That's right. And that, I think, is one of the pitfalls of misguided facilitation. Facilitation is generally a good match for supervisors who like to ask lots of questions and kind of engage in thinking together. And that can work really well when it's matched to the staff person's need. But if the staff person doesn't have the answers because they don't have the experience, ability, or motivation, confidence, it can feel like a real setup. And I will confess that this case study was loosely based on one of my early supervisory fails. The guy didn't cry, but he did get really frustrated with me. But the good news is we got back on track, and I was working for Greenpeace at the time, and he became the deputy director of Greenpeace USA for like 20 years. So it was not permanently damaged. but facilitation gone awry can really cause some problems. What did you think would be a better approach for poor Mark?
So we thought sort of a blend, but having some coaching and facilitative with more directive for specific tasks. In the parts of it that he was unsure about, being more directive.
More directive. And how would the supervisor know what he was unsure of?
I mean, we didn't talk about this much in my group, but I'm just thinking in that first conversation, the fact that he didn't have any answers for the questions, I think should have been kind of a flag.
Yeah, that's great. I think the supervisor could really have been reading the cues better, more accurately. And I think you've also touched on something, coaching. Even if Mark needed some direction, I think coaching could have been really helpful too, because it sounded like he needed a confidence boost. Yep. And it really can make such a big difference when someone with power says, I know you can do this. It can really help set people up for success.
Definitely.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Let's hear from the last group of reporters, someone who was in the delegating group. We've got Anusha. Will you join us and unmute yourself? And once again, give us an example of something really delegatory that this supervisor did.
Sorry, I'm going to apologize. I was just lowering my hand.
Oh, sorry.
I was in the previous group.
You were a different group. Okay, thanks. We've got Caitlin though. How about that? Am I right about that?
Yeah,
sorry. I was just
okay, that's okay. Oh. There you are. Yeah. So tell us something that the supervisor did that was really delegatory.
So we had Mary, we assigned her a whole new project basically, and then we didn't give her much direction and didn't check in with her for 6 weeks.
6 weeks. That is actually delegation gone awry. That should never happen. But it's a case study. So, all right. So Mary was left to her own devices. How did it go?
Not terribly well.
Imagine that.
So when we were looking at her, her ability seemed to be a 5. We put her at a 3 for experience and a 3 for motivation. So we think we probably should have been more of a facilitating style.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Excellent. Thank you. So as we kind of wind down and thinking about these case studies, I want to touch on a couple of questions that I saw in the comments while you were on the break. One person asked, how do you move someone from a 1 to 2 where they need direction to a place where they can be coached or facilitated? And I think that is a good and important question, and I want to answer it with some caveats, with some caution, in that I think it's important to remember that our role is not to get everybody to where we're most comfortable. Our role is to push ourselves, step out of our comfort zones and adapt. And the more effectively we do that, the more successful our staff are going to be. Now that said, there may be times when people just continually function at a 1 or a 2 and need direction, and that's perfectly okay. And there may be times when what you need from them in their job is some greater degree of independence. And so I think that combining styles as someone is moving from one to another can be really helpful, and checking in with them about this. so I've been really directive. I've given you step-by-step directions. You've done this a few times. I'm really confident, you know, you could do this without my step-to-step directions. A little coaching there. So if you had to write the step-to-step directions, what would they be? That sort of thing. That's a little bit of facilitation. So again, I don't think our goal should be always to try to move people up necessarily, but to meet them where they are. But when it is appropriate to move people up, I think sort of combining to the style from which you're operating now to the style where you'd like to move them can be helpful. There are also some observations and some things that we have talked about around the way that identity can come into play, particularly around direction. When we do that straw poll in a live room, direction, and I think it was true here, is generally the style the fewest people choose. And I think that's because it has some negative connotations. We've talked a little bit about micromanagement. I think people are hesitant to be directive because it can feel disrespectful. And on one hand, I want to say not providing direction when it's what someone needs is actually not respectful. The most respectful thing you can do is to provide them with what they need. And in that case study, with all those extreme examples, like what font to use and what breakfast to order, that seems over the top, but it might not be if that's what someone needs. There's someone that I worked with at one point who sent out all of her emails in italics. And nobody wanted to say anything because they were afraid of insulting her. Meanwhile, she's sending emails to the entire organization that people can't stand reading. And so as her supervisor, that was something that I talked with her about, literally about what fonts to use. And I think that was the kindest thing I could do, and also what set her up for better success. All of that said, being directive can have other negative connotations depending on our identities. I'm sure you've heard, you know, women who are directive are full of themselves, I won't use the word, but there are negative connotations for women who have the confidence to be directive. And also when people of color are sometimes directive, it can be seen as being angry or people stepping out of their place, that sort of thing. The responsibility for that doesn't sit with the person who's being directive. It sits with the culture and the society that we operate in. And at the same time, I think it's worth being aware of. I don't think it means that we shouldn't meet people where they are, but I want to just acknowledge that that can be more complicated for some people depending on their identities. Joanne, Owen, Allison, is there anything else you saw that you want me to comment on? I will tell all of you that we probably will have time for just a few questions at the very end. So if I didn't answer questions that you feel are burning, we can do that at the end. And if it's okay with you, Allison, Joanne and I can also make ourselves available by email to chat with people if things come up down the road. Great.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Anything showing up in chat? Any questions that we should be addressing now before we move on?
Let's see. There's one question that just came up on the employee side. How do you deal with a micromanager? So if you're an employee and you have to manage up to someone who is maybe inappropriately directive.
Yes, that's a great question. And one of the things that I really love about this juncture in this training is that we've given you this tool. You have the printed materials or the electronic version of them. You can ask for what you need and you can blame it on us. You can say, hey, I went to this training and look at this cool tool. Here's what I learned about myself. And hey, one of the things I learned is that I think that the directive style is not working for me around this. I would really appreciate some coaching because your cheerleading would motivate me. Or let's try facilitating. I'd love to bounce ideas around with you. So you can actually ask what you need and blame it on us. Anything else?
No, that looks like it right now.
All right. And Joanne, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Well, thank you. So we are closing out for the morning, and the first thing we want to do is really just appreciate all of you for your participation, your thoughtful and insightful ideas, questions, suggestions in the chat, both in the chat and verbally, have been amazing. We're so honored and privileged to be with you all today. We really, really want to thank Allison and everyone at the Chamber for having us here and for all of the technical support they provided and logistical support and just such a great group to work with. I think I speak for Owen, Lynn, and myself that we're really happy to be here. So what we'd like to do is do something that we call an appreciation shower. And realizing as supervisors and leaders that one of the most impactful and important things we can do with our colleagues and our staff and our managers is to appreciate them. So we are going to take just a few minutes, well, not a few minutes, a few seconds really, take everyone off of mute, and we're going to have everyone, we're going to shut down the PowerPoint for a moment so everyone can, hopefully most people can see each other. And we're going to ask for the next 20 seconds that you just do shout outs of appreciation to anyone that you want to do them to. So you can appreciate each other, you can appreciate your breakout room keeps, you can appreciate the folks at the chamber, new ideas, good weather if you're having that there, whatever you want to appreciate. And we're all going to kind of talk simultaneously over each other and see what kind of energy this brings for about 20 seconds. So, well, Allison, you take everyone off mute. And 1, 2, 3, go.
We appreciate
Allison.
And thank you, Lynn.
I appreciate you for taking time.
Thank you,
Joanne and
Allison.
Owen.
Appreciate Owen for all the
Showing up so well
give
and
us.
giving us some
Amazing
Notes today.
You learned so much today.
so engaged, so open. I want to appreciate Anisha's dog. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Oops.
Joanne, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. So that's an appreciation shower. Try it with your team. It's a fun remote activity to do. Keep the energy up. And what we'd really love for you to do is take this tool, take some of the ideas around the supervisory job description and try them. Try them with your staff, talk about them with your team, with your manager. And I know you'll be doing some work with Allison in the chamber and cohorts to kind of really dive into specific real life challenges. So we're hoping that this will help. Sounded like there were a few of you who actually have some conversations or things planned for the next few days even, that you can try some of this out. So good luck to all of you. We'd love to hear how things go. We will be sending out a survey link and putting it in chat, I believe. So we'd love to hear from you. We really do value feedback, both appreciative and constructive. Lynn and I have been training on this content for a long time, but we're very new to a webinar format. So as you may have noticed when I forget to take myself off mute. So any suggestions you have and things that you like, we'd love to hear. So I'm going to turn it back over to Allison.
Before you do that, Allison, let me just jump in. Thank you, Joanne. And I do want to say that Joanne and I can hang around for another 6 or 7 minutes if people want to stay on and unmute yourselves and ask some questions and have some conversation. So after that, I'll turn it over to you, Allison. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the TSNE team, the TSNE MissionWorks team, and the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, our sponsor, by clicking on reactions and the clap emoji to give a virtual round of applause. As always, I have a few takeaways that I'd like to share, but I want to hear from you first. So can you please add your 1 to 3 word takeaway, what you're going to bring with you and bring back to your organization in the chat window, and I'll read a couple out loud. While I'm waiting for them to come in, I'll say that I've seen this before, and every time it makes me really think about how I'm interacting with people, managing up, down, and across. So I think a lot about how I am using either just what my own default preferred style would be, what I wish people would do for me, versus when I'm really thinking about what they need for that particular task. And this always motivates me to think a little bit more critically. So I use different approaches for different tasks or different people, talk more with my team to figure out what they need, adapt, more patience, using the graph, be thoughtful, meet often, maybe even bringing the graph to people to see what they need, build trust, having an awareness of style, being adaptive. What I prefer isn't what they need. Stop thinking that my team needs to adapt to me. That's really good. Be better at meeting people where they are. Think about what style is best for each team member. Observe, assess, and communicate. Yep, using all 3 tools to determine the best style. Really helpful framework for new managers too. Yes, creating more training time. I love these. These are great pieces of feedback of what you're going to bring back to your organization. And I really do believe that effective supervision, both up, down, and across, it really matters right now more than ever while most of us are working remotely. So I'm so glad you're feeling empowered to bring that back to your organization. In the next couple sessions, we're going to keep building on this tool set. So first, next week, May 28th, we're going to give you the opportunity to practice using one of your own cases instead of the Mary Mark case that you were working on today. So I'll ask each of you to bring an actual example of a management challenge you're experiencing, managing up, down, or across that you're comfortable sharing. And I'll put you in random breakout rooms and you'll have the opportunity to share and get advice for about 10 minutes each. And then that is something that you'll get the opportunity to practice using the model to give advice, and also you'll then be able to bring back some pieces of advice you've gotten from the group. And then after that, on June 17th, and this calendar invite is coming to you soon, we are going to have a first virtual session with Harvard Business School, and that will be focused on authentic leadership. And then in July, we will have our workshop with Diversity at Workplace that's all about inclusive leadership. So I feel like a lot of the groundwork that was laid today, the next sessions will build upon. And please do a reminder to take the survey that Owen put in the chat, and I'll email afterwards. Your feedback matters to us a lot. I hope you've already seen that we're kind of bringing in pieces that we've seen from the feedback you've given before into some of these future sessions. So we're really listening and eager to apply that. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. Be well. Feel free to sign off if you have no further questions. If you do have further questions, stick around, unmute yourself and ask them. Thank you.